Okay, so thanks for visiting this video. This is the third of 8 videos on different parts of speech that make up our language. And this one is a very important part of speech. So important that it starts the predicate in the two parts that make up a basic sentence, and that is the verb. The verb shows action or state of being. So you can't have a sentence, you can't have a complete thought without a verb. It's impossible, okay? When we take a look at sentences, we say that every sentence has two ingredients. A subject, that's what the sentence is about. And if you recall from watching the nouns and pronouns video, you know that they both oftentimes operate as subjects. But then we also have, on the other half of a sentence, the predicate. That is, what about the subject? And the predicate always starts with the verb. So when you look at how verbs function in sentences, they are oftentimes referred to as the simple predicate, okay? The verb itself is the simple predicate, and the complete predicate is what about, answers the question, what about the subject? So if I take a look at any of these examples of sentences, the baker cut the bread. The player ran. The bread is good. He could pass the test. We can find the subject in each of those sentences, and then we should also be able to say, what about those subjects? And the rest of the sentence answers that question, okay? So if you take a look at the examples of different kinds of verbs, we have eat, find, run, walk, become, feel, seem, are, was. Those are just some examples. But what we're going to talk about when we look at each of those examples and how they are in these example sentences is that there's different kinds of verbs. And I want you to understand how they function in a sentence, not just this textbook definition. Okay? So let's focus first on actions. If you take a look at the examples, if you can do it, it's an action. So we can eat, it's an action. We can find, we can run, we can walk. Okay? These kinds of words are called actions, and they're the most common verbs that you'll find, and oftentimes the easiest to spot, because if you can do it, it's an action, okay? If we take a look at the first sentence here, the baker cut the bread. The sentence is about what? The answer, the subject, should be baker. And remember from our previous video, baker is a noun. That's a person, right? So, what about the baker? What did the baker do? He cut the bread. So, cut the bread is our predicate, and cut is an action. That's a verb, okay? If we take a look at our second sentence, the player ran. Player is our subject. He's what the sentence is about, or she. And then what did the player do? The player ran. Ran is the verb in the sentence. So cut the bread is the complete predicate. The simple predicate is cut in the first sentence. And there's only one word in the second predicate. So ran, the verb, is the predicate. Okay? Both of them are action verbs, but I want to talk about the two distinct differences, okay? If you look at the baker cut the bread, the baker is active. What you should ask yourself after you establish that there is an action in a sentence is something being acted upon? And if you take a look at this first sentence, if I asked you, is something being cut? Is something being acted upon by the baker? The answer is yes, that something is bread. So that makes cut an example of a word we would call transitive. There are a few different kinds of verbs, and one of the action verbs is called a transitive action verb. And what that simply means is a verb that transfers action to if you remember from our previous video, direct object. Bread here is a direct object because it's being acted upon by the subject, the baker. He's cutting the bread, okay? So whenever you have transfer, look at in transfer, it means movement. Whenever you have transfer of action from a subject to an object, that verb is considered a transitive verb, okay? Now, let's take a look conversely at sentence 2, the player ran. In that sentence, we do have an action verb. Just like cut, we can run. It's a physical action. But in the context of this sentence, ask yourself the same question. Is something being ran? The answer is no. There's nothing after the verb. There's no transfer of action from the subject player to some kind of object or direct object. Therefore, ran, in the context of this sentence, is what we call intransitive. Now, intransitive looks a lot like the other word, doesn't it? With one distinct difference. There's a prefix in front of transitive. That means not or no. In other words, there is no transfer of action from a subject to a player. And that's what intransitive means. It means, running out of space over here, no transfer of action to a direct object. Okay? So when you look at action verbs, they can be one of two options. They can be transitive or they can be intransitive. And the difference is whether or not they transfer action from a subject doing something to a direct object. All right? That's the first thing I want to talk about, and that's action verbs. Now, take a look at the third sentence here. I'm going to clear the screen. If we take a look at this third sentence, the bread is good, ask yourself a question. Is there any action in that sentence? The subject is what the sentence is about. Bread is the subject. But the bread's not doing anything, right? The bread is being described in the sentence as being good. This kind of sentence is called a complement. And when you have words, when you have sentences that have complements, they won't have actions. They'll still be complete thoughts, but they don't show action. That's because they complete this other task. They have state of being verbs. Okay? Now, state of being simply means that the subject is being something. In this case, the bread is being good. Okay? There are a lot of different kinds of states of being verbs. And all of them, you can say, don't show action. There's no action in the sentence. There's a really easy way for us to remember all of the state of being verbs, and I'd like to share it with you. Okay? I like to draw here. If you think about state of being, I want you to think about a little guy. I'm going to put a top hat on him because that's how it was taught to me. Don't know why. And picture him as a guy who just immigrated to the United States. He doesn't come from France or Germany or Mexico or China. He comes from a mythical place, the state of being, okay? He comes from the state of being, and his name is Mr. Isamar. B, like the middle initial B, was Worthy. I know it sounds like a silly name, Mr. Isamar B. Wasworthy. If you can remember that silly sounding name, then you will remember all of the state of being verbs. Let's take a look. Is. In our second example here, is the verb. It's what is functioning as the linking verb in the sentence. We oftentimes call state of being verbs linking verbs. It's like a big equal sign. It's taking the bread and equaling it to good. Okay, there's no action. It's like an equal sign. Is the state of being verb or the linking verb. Am is a linking verb. I am hungry. We are here. Any state of the verb to be, okay, could be considered a state of being verb. Was, were, and been. These are all examples of state of being verbs, and if you remember the name, you'll be able to spot state of beings. When I look at a sentence, I first check for an action when I'm trying to break down its components. And if I can't find an action, I know there's a state of being in there somewhere. Okay? Let's take a look at the third example, because the third example adds a little wrinkle to what we've just talked about. Okay? If you look on this sentence, he could pass the test. There is an action in this sentence, so there's no state of being, but there's more going on here. The subject of the sentence, what the sentence is about, is he. And then we ask ourselves, what's he doing? Well, he could pass the test. So could pass the test is the predicate, okay? Now, there is an action in that sentence because you can pass something, yes? I would hope so. So pass is a verb. And because he's passing the test, he's acting upon the test, we would call pass transitive, to review. But there's also this word could here. Could is an example of a helping verb. You see, when we create sentences, we change the tense. That means when something happens all the time. So if we happen, in this case, he hasn't passed the test yet, right? It's not he passed the test, it's he could pass the test. It's a hypothetical that he could pass the test if he studied or anything else. So could is changing the condition in which the verb is occurring, the time, okay? When we use helping verbs, we change the tense of the sentence, of the verb, and that happens oftentimes. So when we say things like could run, might go, things like should have won. These are all examples of verb phrases. Verb phrases. And what we mean by that is that there's not just one singular verb in the sentence or in the clause. There is a verb phrase. A verb phrase will always contain a main verb, MV stands for main verb, and helping verbs. And there could be more than one, like in this context. Should have. Should have won. The helping verbs are should and have. In could run and might go, could and might are helping verbs to the main verbs run and go. Okay? There are a number of helping verbs. On the link that I am going to share with you, there is a link to a song that you can actually listen to. It's kind of a familiar tune that lists all the helping verbs. So if you'd like to listen to it, it could help you remember them. But what I'm more concerned about is that you just understand, you can identify by how they're functioning. They'll always be right in front of the verb, the main verb, and they will change the context in which that verb's happening, the tense. Okay? So this is how verbs work. They show action, or they show a state of being. And in the under that umbrella of action, we have two kinds of